Hello, and welcome to 5 Minutes of Postgres. My name is Lucas, and today we're going to talk about logical decoding on a standby in Postgres 16. This is a blog post by Bertrand from the AWS Postgres contributors team. In this blog post, he describes a feature that he co-authored in Postgres 16. Before we jump into this, I want to point out that this feature has been worked on for a long time. Back in 2018, Andres Freund started a thread that said minimal logical decoding on standby, which aimed to achieve what now in Postgres 16 is reality. And shortly before the feature freeze, this feature was pushed. Pushed means this is in Postgres 16 as of right now, but because Postgres 16 still will undergo multiple months of testing, there is of course a small risk that this won't make it, but I think chances are good. What Bertrand describes in his post is how this new feature works and how you can benefit from it. First of all, before this commit, when you try to create a logical replication slot on a standby server in Postgres, Postgres will actually give you an error and say logical decoding cannot be used while in recovery. Logical decoding, just to be clear, was used underneath the hood of logical replication, which also often powers other processes that extract data from Postgres, for example, to be used in the application or when you're doing transfers to other systems. With the change in Postgres 16, when you're on a standby, you can actually create a logical replication slot. There are a few mechanics around this that make this work slightly differently than if you're creating a logical replication slot on a primary. Most importantly, you might be waiting a little bit longer for the slot to actually be created. To speed that up, what you can do is you can run the new PGLog standby snapshot function on the primary. What it does behind the scenes is it produces a special wall record that is required on the secondary. There's a whole other story around this if you really want to dive deep. But the point is, if you're seeing yourself wait a longer time for the logical replication slot to be created, call this function to speed it up on the primary. Let's take a look at an example. We have a table called BET here that just has a single column. We can see the logical decoding message insert, and we can see the data that was being inserted. This is fairly standard, but what is special about this here is that you're running all of this whilst you're on standby. Now, the really awesome thing about this is that you can use this whilst the standby gets promoted. So let's say you run the pgreceive logical command, which outputs the replication stream in a separate process. Now, let's say you're promoting the standby to be the new primary. And what's amazing is that you could actually observe that the pgreceive logical process is not going to interrupt. You can keep following the logical replication stream whilst the failover happens. Second, in the newly promoted primary, we can now insert data, and you can see that the pgreceive logical process that was reading the replication stream seamlessly got that data. You can imagine that if there are subscribers, they can keep having an open connection to standby, and if the standby gets promoted, they can seamlessly follow without having to worry about reset connections or making any other changes. There's one more thing to note here. This doesn't just apply to decoding, but also to logical replication. To create a table, and then it's important to note you would have to create the publication on the primary, because publications in Postgres, they're catalog objects. You couldn't create those on the secondary, and then you're creating a subscription, but instead of getting an error, you will now just get created replication slot, and it will just work. I think this really enables a lot of new things in Postgres, because previously logical decoding could become a bottleneck. You can imagine everything needing to happen on the primary means that actually reading a wall for logical decoding and all that work had to happen on the primary, put the limit to how much decoding you can do. And then also just the fact that this can seamlessly follow failovers, that will enable more resilient architectures that rely on logical replication or logical decoding throughout how they're built. There is a few things to understand in certain conditions. Most importantly, if you're running hot standby feedback off, that will actually be a situation where there is a higher chance of certain conflict scenarios where ultimately the replication slots in a standby would be invalidated. Just be aware that in some cases you might see slots being invalidated. And so it's important to be able to check that and actually respond to that. All in all, a really important building block for more sophisticated architectures that rely on Postgres. And I look forward to using it in Postgres 16. Thank you so much for listening. This was 5 Minutes of Postgres. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to hear about next week's episode, and talk to you next week.